So welcome to our special event today. Today we're going to have Dr. Anthony Ashbolt share with us on the politics of Oz, which is very much a part of the magazine publications. Anthony is a senior lecturer in politics in the School of History and Politics here at UOW. A highly published author, his special interests include US politics, politics in the media, protest movements, political and cultural theory, the 1960s, and Australian politics. A long list of publications can be found in research online via the library website, which includes a cultural history of the radical 60s in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is actually officially launched here in 2013. So we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Ashbolt back today to outline the political context which gave rise to this landmark counterculture magazine. Please welcome him here today.
Thank you. I should qualify history and politics. We've changed to politics and international studies, and the school is humanities and social inquiry. Things change as one gets older and older. The politics of Oz magazine. The inspiration for the title Oz derives from two fairly obvious sources: Australia itself, and the film in particular, The Wizard of Oz. The fact that the lyrics to the songs in the film were written by a socialist, Yip Harburg, may not have been known to the editors. It's not known to many people, actually. But the dreamlike, surrealist essence of the film was. And the essential politics of Oz magazine was often filtered through a dreamlike surrealism provided essentially by the great graphic artist Martin Sharp. Yet its politics could also be hard-hitting, whether the barbs be directed at the conformist suburbia of Menzies, Australia, censorship, the religious establishment, the monarchy, the political elite generally, racism, although there could arguably have been much more on racism, and certain politicians in particular, as well, of course, as Vietnam. At the outset, it must be said that, as with a lot of satire, some of it was a bit hit and miss. There was, for example, a particularly crude attempt at satirising the position of American blacks in Oz 3, May 1963. Commencement of 1963, nigger hunting season was its title, accompanied by a tasteless ad for a tin of Little Sambo boneless tinned nigger. Such hopeless undergraduate humour was to be expected in a magazine edited by then undergraduates. So what is surprising in the end is how much holds up to present day scrutiny, how important most of the targets were and how accurately they were hit. Lame satire, such as the example just given, was there, but so too was very sharp wit, and the pun is intended, and a libertarian politics that was at least refreshing, if not radical enough for most of us on the left of politics. It is sometimes assumed that libertarianism substantially leans to the left, whereas the Andersonian libertarian scene in Sydney, from which Oz and many of its writers and supporters sprang, kept a discreet distance from the left, much like the distance that I recall very well myself at the Sussex Hotel in Sydney in the early 1970s between Paddy McGuinness and some former Andersonians on one side of the bar, and the left and some former Andersonians like Liz Fell on the other. And one of my friends, the poet Peter Newton, moved easily somehow between the two. The point is this: Oz cannot be slotted neatly into an ideological spectrum, as its irreverence shone flashlights everywhere, even though it was mostly focused upon what we would call the establishment. A Marxist might locate the editor's eclecticism as originating in privileged surrounds. Thus it is Craig McGregor, in an intriguing profile of the artist Gary Shedd, the, quote, celebrant of suburbia, this is Oz 28, June 1966, referred somewhat sarcastically to the background of what Vogue magazine had called our youth Quakers. And he goes through the list of the Oz people. Richard Walsh, from Gordon and Barker College. Note Chris Lilly was from Barker. And of course, Summer Heights High is one of those very clever satires of private schools. Richard Neville, Mossman and Knox College. Martin Sharp, Bellevue Hill and Cranbrook. Gary Shedd, Pymble and Shaw. McGregor put it succinctly, they've all had something worth rebelling against. Thus it is that in Oz 11, July 1964, Gary Shedd has a near full-page cartoon entitled The GPS Boy. It was a blistering attack on a parent buying his son's private school education at an elite school through the gift of a dome commemorating the boys of the school lost in the First World War. Following the boys' failure in sport, the father offers up 2 more domes. The boy becomes head prefect and wins a number of prizes, including the Packer Prize for proficiency. And speaking of Packer, the mainstream press is subjected to withering scrutiny in the pages of Australian Oz, and the picture that emerges is hardly foreign today. It is one of a concentrated press, much as we know it today, and it is a press that is dumbed down, much as we know it today. There's a marvellous cartoon by Martin Sharp, and I may as well note here that the early pre-psychedelic Sharp, the Sharp that you see mostly around you here, was influenced heavily by the great American cartoonist Jules Feiffer. Something that John Olson noted in the famous Oz trial in Australia that I don't have time to go into today, and I don't have time to go into the London Oz trial either. Back to the Sharp cartoon. Newspapers in it have gone into a steep decline because, quote, murderers went into hibernation, and the brothels were opened, and the sex perverts laid off the kiddies, and no one discovered any death drugs, and the royal family was healthy, and there was nothing to write about except war. But none of these wars eventuated, and the decline of sales continued to the point where newspapers died. But then China invaded Australia. Sharp concludes, but no one was interested in reading about any more filthy wars, and no one bought any papers. But there was a war, and everyone was killed. And so we come to the subject of war. And don't worry, folks, I'm leaving sex until later. Conscious of waning attention spans, including my own. The early Oz barely featured war, as Vietnam was not to hit centre stage for nearly 2 years after its first issue. Nonetheless, there are digs at Anzac Day in Oz 2, alternative rights by Pro Bono Publico, arguing that the major festivals of Easter, Christmas and Anzac Day are all increasingly irrelevant, partly because of the seasons, Easter and Christmas. Regarding Anzac Day, quote, it worked for a while when Gallipoli was still in people's mind. Now that historical event is half remembered. And by the year 2000 and, guess what, 15, Anzac Day will be an anomaly, or else it will be converted into something else. You can afford to be wrong once. Yet in the same issue there is an attempted but lame caustic satire of a C&D march by A. Bob Hughes, yes, the art critic, the great art critic, the late great art critic Robert Hughes. The establishment, you see, could be of all stripes and persuasions, even anti-war, and thus it is not so strange to find Hughes writing cynically about a C&D march, because we find Richard Walsh in Oz 25, February 1966, referring cynically to the anti-war movement via means of an attack on Fred May, whom I remember well, the esteemed professor of Italian at Sydney University. Quote, currently the professor is trying to get back into the Vietnam teaching circuit. Here he is back on safe, familiar, absolutist grounds, the teachings, absolutist grounds. Being a pacifist, Walsh adds, he can oppose the Australian commitment in Vietnam without trying to involve himself in the intricacies of Asian politics. This is what I mean by the establishment could be here, there and everywhere. It was not just the right-wing establishment. To continue, Walsh said, the Vietnam bandwagon, note that, the Vietnam bandwagon is already sagging from the weight of numbers, but somehow we feel that Fred will manage to get ahead. These are hardly the words of a man of the left, and I don't think it's controversial to suggest that Richard Walsh was not a man of the left. I doubt whether Richard would disagree with that categorisation. And they do stand in sharp contrast to, say, two brilliant Martin Sharp cartoons and other articles in Australian Oz and then later London Oz. First, Sharp's cover of Oz 19, May 1965, all the way with LBJ, which is somewhere up here. I had it picked out earlier. All the way with LBJ, there it is. You can see it up there. Now remember, this is May 1965. Johnson is a giant eagle dropping big bombs with a bumbling pig-like bird. Bob Menzies dropping what could only be described as bird shit. It is a splendid piece of graphic art and a superb commentary on Vietnam as well. And in Oz 25, January 1966, a smaller Sharp cartoon has Johnson with his gallant Texan hat, an eagle on his shoulder, saying, quote, peace offensive in bold, is really a cute name for war. Ha, ha. Now, believe it or not, that was a term used by the American military and government establishment. Peace offensive. Peace offensive, Martin Sharp said, is really a cute name for war. Ha, ha. Sharp was, to put it bluntly, more in tune with the Orwellian overtones of the American war in Vietnam than Richard Walsh. That particular cartoon accompanied a highly nuanced piece by Francis James entitled St. Francis in Hanoi, where the maverick and charmingly eccentric James, and I use the terms charmingly eccentric not as an historian but as someone who knew Francis James quite well, who was editor of the Anglican and also briefly publisher of Oz magazine, chronicled his trip to North Vietnam, one of those early ones to make trips, not as early as Tom Hayden and some others in late 1955 from America, but Francis had extraordinary contacts. No one could work out quite what his contacts were. In fact, in that article, he suggests that an Anglican friend of his in China got him into North Vietnam. I find that story somewhat surprising. But it's a very interesting tale about North Vietnam, and he says he's not allowed to quote from them, but he spoke to, amongst others, according to Francis, Ho Chi Minh and General Giap. Quote, they were so considerate and courteous that I felt humbled at any Australian boorishness by the time I left. Anyone who knew Francis knew he was far from boorish. Donnish might be a better description of Francis. But he made clear, quite clear, crystal clear, his support for the Vietnamese. Unanimous, with one heart and voice, Hanoi says it will win, and he agrees. Later, in Oz 27, May 66, there is a satire on the language of Saigon correspondence using terms like, quote, the Viet Cong, are a cunning foe. The Viet Cong are a cunning foe. Now, it's interesting the use of the term Viet Cong there, used by our correspondents all the time, because James makes it clear that this is insulting to the Vietnamese, who should be known as the National Liberation Front and or the Viet Minh, but the National Liberation Front was James' preferred term, and mine also. Unlike the Berkeley Barb, Oz magazine did not have its real origins in the struggle against the American war in Vietnam, so it was not a defining element of the magazine, either in Australia or in London, but it did feature in both. The struggle against censorship and a focus on sexual politics could arguably be seen as defining elements of this magazine, which is, after all, a tale of two cities. And that is interesting in itself. Two very different cities with two very different styles, two very different tones, very different ways of life, if you like, and two very different regimes of censorship, for example. Sydney, characterised by severe censorship. The other, London or England generally, Britain generally, relative freedom in this regard. Thus, Richard Walsh, in an article called Twilight of Society, I think I glanced at it up there, you might read it later, but that's in Oz 2, says this, so very early Oz. In Britain, they can laugh at the Queen and read Lady Chapley's Lover and Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer. Here they cannot. It is quite extraordinary, the regime of censorship that existed in Australia in the early 1960s. And of course, it was a Liberal minister, Don Shipp, who later in that decade lifted that lid on censorship. And there are some mutterings through the early Oz magazine about, will we ever be able to read these things like Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer and Lady Chapley's Lover, etc., etc., and we were, of course. What I just referred to, Twilight of Sanity, is part of a treatise by Walsh about what real democracy is. Beg pardon. Democracy in Australia is the right of the individual, he said, to interfere as much as he can in the lives of his fellow men, and the privilege of institutions to cater for the lowest common denominator of public taste. Particularly that first bit one might see as a rather strange definition of democracy, the right of the individual to interfere as much as he can in the lives of his fellow men. His tongue was firmly in cheek, shall we say, because later Walsh qualifies this with what we can see as the classic John Mills liberal proposition, or Millian liberal proposition, shall we say. People should be allowed to lead their own lives so long as they do not interfere with others. Walsh mentions that the two articles to cause most concern in the first issue of Oz, Oz 1, were one on abortion and the other on masturbation. And Oz number 1 did have a reasonably informative article about abortion, including, and remember this is 1963, so that's fairly early in the piece, including interviews with two women who had procured them. One of those abortions was self-administered, and with Dr. X, an abortionist who proved an understandably reluctant interviewee. The reference to masturbation was from a speech in Queensland Hansard, so the quote is from Queensland Hansard, where a politician quoted from a newspaper called The Free Thinker, quote, perhaps the filthiest thing ever written. And it included a speech, Are Morals Outdated, by a Dr. Kenny. The Free Thinker, from memory, was edited by, amongst others, Bruce McFarlane of the Labor Party. But anyway, this speech is Are Morals Outdated by Dr. Kenny. Not only did this speech refer specifically to male masturbation, Germaine might have had something to say about that, did have something later on to say about that, but also, and note again, this is 1963, advocated homosexual marriage equality.
Huh.
That was just so bizarre that it seems not to have attracted the attention of the establishment in the way that abortion and masturbation did. Yet, of course, England had its Profumo scandal, and it came to the attention of Oz4 in an article, quote, "And as Britannia sinks slowly into the West." It is a rather clever satire, with Harold Macmillan giving a speech, a supposed speech, combining Churchillian pomposity and surreal satire. Homosexuals in the Admiralty, heterosexuals in the War Office, a photographer in the palace, and Prince Charles in a Scottish pub. Such is the primrose path that leads to everlasting bonfire. A once great nation. Is it reduced to this? A pimpocracy of call girls, an aristocracy of adulteresses, a royalty of alcoholics, a nation guided by prostitutes and madams, by satyrs and nymphomaniacs, by agents provocateurs and bone manipulators. To continue the England-Australia comparison, the late Nick Waterlow, who died in tragic circumstances, Sydney's famous art dealer, put it this way, reflecting upon his return to Australia from England in 1965. 1965 felt as though, at best, I had returned to an England of the early 1950s. A dull, provincial and restrictive place. There were, though, some remarkable and, for me, reassuring pockets of resistance, and the presence of Oz magazine was certainly one. Yet, interestingly, when Richard Neville arrived in London in 1966, he found it less than swinging. What swingers there were, quote, huddled around hookers in Notting Hill, prancing on King's Road in satirical military garb, organising anti-war demos outside Australia House, flocking to the Albert Hall to hear beat poets howl against the machine. Neville then saw that with expats scattered from Earl's Court to Sloane Square, there was an opening for something like a London Oz. And this is, in a way, is a rather peculiar event, the transition, if you like, even while Oz continued in Australia too, its London presence identifying very much with the Australian community there, but transcending it also. Further, adds Neville, meanwhile, to the politics of protest, Oz added a dash of fairy dust impudence and classy design. The posters of Martin Sharp sparkled from the hoardings. The crystalline mocking of Germaine Greer blew the underwear off Oxbridge dons. Quite literally, one might add. So, unsurprisingly, for a period, London Oz was banned in Australia. Briefly, with regard to design, a direct comparison can be made with International Times. That's the magazine to compare it with in 1966. And IT began in October 66 with a rather conventional, a very conventional layout. Later it added the IT, or IT girl, to the front cover, or covers, about which Germaine might have had something to say. Louise Ferrier certainly did have something to say. The sexism of the underground press, as Louise Ferrier noted, and she worked closely with Oz magazine in London, was becoming increasingly obvious. So now, and all too briefly, on to London Oz. Richard Neville made his growing politics, developing politics, fairly clear by bringing socialist David Widgery on board, as well as Germaine Greer, yet to be a fully fledged feminist, but very much in iconoclastic mould and certainly on the road to a kind of sexual liberationist feminism. Yet Oz is remembered, of course, more for its psychedelic, at least in the early years, more for its psychedelia, I suppose you could say, courtesy of Martin Sharp, than its politics. The psychedelia really began not with Oz number 1 in London, but with Oz number 3. Now, on the surface, this design element has little to do with politics, and yet dig a little deeper and there is a cultural politics at work. It is a cultural politics rooted in a tradition of surrealism, but also with links, and given this is England, however slim, to the arts and craft movement surrounding the utopian socialist William Morris. And here we are back in that utopian sensibility that Richard Walsh actually referred to specifically at the opening of this exhibition, and the utopian sensibility that, as I suggested, is captured by the very title, Oz. There is arguably a type of utopian dreaming in the developing psychedelic art of Martin Sharp, as you can see in the wall around you. For example, the Dylan cover of London Oz, or his famous and explosive Hendrix. Most people know as a poster, but it was actually the cover of Oz 15 also. Or even the album covers of Disraeli Gears, and both the studio and live albums, Wheels of Fire. Yet, David Widgery, a more classically traditional Marxist come Trotskyist, a fellow traveller with, if not a member of, I think he was a member of, for a time, the International Socialists, saw no real possibilities in the counterculture or hippies, and was even scathing about the Australian scene in London. But Neville had invited him on board. It caused a bit of a ruction between Neville and Sharp, to the point where Sharp nearly left the magazine fairly on, but luckily for us, stayed. Here's Widgery in issue 2 of the London Oz. But on the whole, the place is horrible. This is London. And this is due to the people. There are far too many Australians. The incredible love generation is completely wrapped up with glittering their beautiful eyes at each other. The rich old hippies are substantially worse, though. In the same issue, we witness the burgeoning feminist sexual politics of someone called Germaine, who chastises models, fashion models, that are narrow-chested, noting that any lass with boobs knows that fashion has passed her by. Greer's own breasts were to appear somewhat later on, in a later issue, as well as a provocative cover of her with Jim Anderson undoing his zip, and she was to go on, of course, and become a co-editor of the pornographic magazine, Suck magazine. She's written about this quite openly, and she has put it this way: I thought it was liberating. I was wrong. But there was a time there when people did see that sort of thing as liberating. And she was, in terms of Oz magazine, to go on to edit the issue 29, or to be very much involved in, as well as editing Female Energy, or as it was called on page 3, Welcome to, excuse the language, Cunt Power Oz. That's July 1970. Oz London was not just sexual politics or the counterculture. Vietnam was still a presence. So take London Oz 10, the pornography of violence, which is a blood spatter. The Great Society blows another mind. A wonderful use of phrase there. A later issue has a photo of American troops with two heads and headless bodies, just subtitled, "Where We're At." There's also Oz 24 with an article on the war by Jerry Rubin. So too, there was analysis of the political situation, and specifically torture in Greece, the May Revolution in France, a an article on policing, G. William Domhoff on the prospects of revolution in corporate America and corporate Great Britain, John Gurassi on the prospects of revolution also. I mean, these were people genuinely of the left, of the type that didn't really appear systematically in Australian Oz magazine. And that's why I refer to the kind of the developing leftward inclination of Richard Neville, which was really only to find maturation back in Australia when he became a little bit older, in a sense, in a funny sort of sense. But there was even controversy from a different perspective, with our own Clive James weighing in with an attack on the juvenilia of the underground, and weighing in quite heavily. And he wasn't the only one who was invited on board to make commentary that was fairly critical of the tendencies of the counterculture. And as I've said, one of the key people brought into London Oz by Richard Neville, David Widgery, was quite critical. So Oz was not politically correct, shall we put it, and indeed remained imbued with a libertarian spirit that encouraged contrarians like Clive James, at the same time as more orthodox leftists like Widgery. Thus we have Widgery's critique of Richard Neville's book Play Power in Oz 26, February-March 1970. Quote, "Neville just does not convince me that tinkering with lifestyle and an occasional brush with the police amounts to a revolution. Behind the scream, crash and wallop, the underground still smells of checkbooks and an expensive education." There is much truth to this observation. Yet the story of Oz and the underground is still remarkable, with Martin Sharp, whose influence was fading by 1970 to some extent, being an imposing presence in the magazine. To some extent, Sharp it was who embodied the soul of Oz, just as Oz embodied the soul of a critical sensibility that punctured the rigid mindset of Australian culture, politics and society, and English pretensions and pomposity.
You've only mentioned two women. Were there really only two women involved with the Australian and London Oz?
With the Australian Oz directly in the editorial position, no woman. In London, there were various people involved in various positions, not in the lead editorial positions, as my memory serves me correctly. So if you look at Australian Oz, the editors are Richard, for a period, there's someone else whose name escapes me who comes along a little bit later, and only very briefly actually. The editors are Richard Walsh and Richard Neville, and the art editor is Martin Sharp. And then you have other contributors like Gary Shedd and so on, but they're not the editors. In London, the editors are Richard Neville, Jim Anderson, Martin Sharp, art editor, and Felix Dennis. And then people like Louise Ferry and so on the sidelines. Germaine Greer, if my memory serves me correctly, was not officially an editor except of that one issue, in the same way that Jim Anderson was the editor of the school kids issue, which I didn't mention. And now the paradox about the school, the one thing I couldn't, I edited it out, but paradoxically the school kids issue is not the most graphic issue of London Oz magazine. Why they took it to court is completely beyond me when you go and look at one of the other issues, which is the sex fair issue. I forget which issue it is, but it's very explicit, including prepubescent girls, etc., etc. But that's another story. Yeah, women were on the sidelines. That's why Louise Ferrier noted the sexism. It isn't that they were involved creatively, so they didn't just make the tea. I wouldn't make that point. But sure, this was amalgamated.
Could I just add Marcia Rowe was involved
Sure.
with Sydney Oz, and she went on to create Spare Rib.
That's right. Yeah.
It was a very significant magazine, so she was Australian. But
Yeah. But she wasn't part of the main editorial staff.
No.
She was, No, but that's right. Yeah, I'd forgotten her. Yeah. But yeah, you do get these other magazines springing out of Oz, which is very important. And that includes feminist magazines. And when I was referring to the sexual libertarianism earlier, I mean, when you look at the origins of women's liberation in whatever country, its origins are as a sexual liberation movement. And it wasn't anti-male in the first instance in any sense.
do you think Oz editors were taken to court because of the politics, or it wasn't just necessarily the profanity and that, was it? Why were they subject to 3 court cases both in Australia and...
Yeah. And the major one in Australia. Why? The politics had something to do with it. If my memory serves me correctly, actually, the publisher of the main one that caused the court case in Australia, was that issue 4 with the Tom Bass sculpture on the front?
And the Martin Sharp cartoon.
And thereabouts, there are quite a few other things in it as well.
I'm just wondering, it wasn't necessarily the profanity, it was getting the backup of the authorities, of however you want to...
Sure, you were dealing with an incredibly conservative establishment, including a legal establishment, and as I said, a heavily censored regime that they managed to sidestep from time to time, much like American screenwriters managed to sidestep the Hayes ruling in America in very, very clever ways often. Why was the more explicit Oz in London not caught up rather than the school kids issue? Because the school kids issue looked like it was, because they were using school kids, they were provocative. They could make, there were hints of paedophilia, etc. That they could throw at them. Yet, of course, this was while it was under the final editorial control of Jim Anderson. It really was the school kids. These sorts of censorship trials are always political, and you just have to read the transcripts, and the transcripts read in certain ways very much like the trial of the Chicago 8, Chicago 7 in America. There is politics running right through it. Because, you've got, sure, the main people in that trial were Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, who used the same sort of satirical framework of reference that Oz used in trying to confront the verities of the establishment. So yes, of course they were political.
How much influence do you think that Oz had on the average Australian? So someone growing up in the suburbs, even if they're interested in the kind of things being discussed, would they have been able to access the magazine, or was it more for people that already moved into fairly liberal sort of circles?
Well, my brother-in-law grew up in Bathurst and he got every issue.
There you go.
But he was pretty extraordinary, coming from a left-wing background. The ordinary Australian was not influenced by Oz to any great degree. Of course, it was part of the fringe. It was in just the same way as these sorts of left-wing or quasi-left-wing or anti-establishment or libertarian magazines aren't going to appeal to the mainstream. It had a reasonably wide circulation for a magazine of its sort, in the thousands and even up to the tens of thousands, and that's not bad for that sort of magazine. But I'll put it in the context of in the 1960s and 1970s, the anti-war movement and radical students weren't the majority on campus. I mean, there were the engineers and others. There was, there was one moment in the history of the student movement where a definite majority was on the side of the leadership of a great campaign for student rights, and that is the free speech movement in Berkeley. That's the one moment.
Yeah.
That was the majority.
Where did most of the funds come to produce the magazine?
Boy, I know Francis James helped them out a little bit from the Anglican.
He printed on their press.
But most of the funds they came from privileged backgrounds. I'm not sure of the Michael.
Rich fathers, by the
Well,
sounds of things.
Gary Shedd's dad owned Shed Real Estate and had a stack of money.
Right,
So
yeah.
I suspect somehow Gary was getting some money into the thing off that. But, you know, Walsh's background and all the others make me think that Mummy and Daddy are providing some funds.
Yes, and I mean, it's probably more easily explained in London Magazine because they hooked into a big network of people where there was money. I mean, a lot of the leading left-wing lights around New Left Review and so on, some of whom did write for Oz Magazine, came from fairly wealthy backgrounds. I'm not saying that they financed it, but I'm just saying that I can see where the sources of money are there. In Australia, I'll have the same stab and say my memory is that significant sections of the legal elite and the professional arts elite were quite wealthy, and some of the money would have come from those sources.
I think that's all we've got time for today, but can we just thank Dr. Ashbolt once again? So this presentation, as well as the launch and our last presentation, which is in a fortnight on the 4th, will be available online. We've got an online exhibition that you can access through the library website. In 2 weeks' time, on Friday the 4th of December, we will have London co-editor Jim Anderson coming to talk about the art in Oz. So that should be another fascinating journey that's going to provide a little bit more insight, very personal insight, firsthand about that. But thank you for coming along once again today, and please enjoy our exhibition.